So, very good afternoon, dear students. The topic for this online video lecture is the role of culture in international human resource management and then how we go about managing cross cultures. So, when you look at international business as such, and when we're looking at companies spreading across, expanding to different continents and countries of the world, setting up subsidiaries, and when they do that, they obviously come in contact or in interaction with where people of various societies and cultures wherever they have to set up subsidiaries. And in the course of doing this, people they would have to interact with people of different nationalities who belong to different societies, and they have very different cultural moorings and cultural backgrounds. And meeting with them on a daily basis, interacting with them, understanding the cultural nuances, understanding what it means, with respect to every element of culture, and those interactions very key for success for any expatriates. And one of the very key aspects that we've got to keep in mind when it comes to expatriate training, and also finally to ensure that the expatriate is successful in his or her international assignment, purely lies on how quickly and how well they are able to adjust to the culture of a different country where they're going to go and work. And that shows how important culture is, and then how quickly they are able to learn, understand, adapt, and and be able to work with people of those different cultures and nationalities. So let us look at in detail, the various aspects that this is going to enlighten us, and then how we can go about understanding the various aspects of culture. So culture describes us as a set of customs, ideas, and social behavior of a group of similar people in society. So geographical borders usually segregate culture. So some characteristics like language, religion, food habits, social norms, music, and arts stay specific in one particular culture. So what makes people of different societies very different are these various elements that I read out, and that's what makes people of a different culture different from each other, because most of societies are very geographically segregated, which is not the case now, but earlier it was geographically segregated. So every group of people living in a particular society had something of their own that they could feel very proud of, or feel very happy about that identity, and always had a lot of behavioral expressions which came out of those cultures that they were part of. Cross culture in business, a very important aspect when we look at international business, and specifically for expatriates. It refers to a company's efforts to increase its employees' ability to interact effectively with professional associates and colleagues from different backgrounds and nationalities. So, as we've seen in the IHRM context, how employees will have to deal with parent country nationals, host country nationals, and third country nationals. So when you are doing this, obviously you're coming in contact and interaction with people of different societies and nationalities. So understanding having an understanding of cross culture and knowing the backgrounds from which these different nationals that you're going to be interacting with are coming from, and then understanding those different cultural elements and being very sensitive to those cultural aspects of those people is very very key and very essential for success in international business, and also for expatriates. The concept of cross culture is becoming critically important with globalization of businesses, because that's giving rise to more and more businesses expanding and going out of their borders. Many companies that seek to expand the markets for their products devote substantial resources to training employees on how to communicate and interact effectively with those from other cultures, because the key to expansion and the key to success in international business depends on how well employees of our country are able to go to different countries of the world and are able to set up businesses over there, set up subsidiaries, interact with customers, clients, suppliers, and be able to get connected with people of that particular country. And that is what makes international business very successful. And if expatriates have to really implement that strategy and do really well, then they have to be cross culturally trained. And that's where companies today are investing a lot of time, money, effort to ensure that the employees who go to different countries of the world or who take up international assignments are really well trained in terms of cross culture and are very sensitive to the various issues that are there in different countries of the world and are able to very smoothly work with the people of those cultures and implement the strategies that we've developed for our company's international business. So, what are the different elements of culture? So when we look at the different elements of culture, we're looking at national. So what is the difference in culture between different societies and in different countries? So language is very different. Nationality, sex, education, profession, ethnic groups and backgrounds, religion, social class, corporate culture that exists in different companies in different countries of the world, family orientation, values, norms, attitude, folkways, and finally customs. So, what makes a society very different? Now, these are the elements that make a society very different. So, whichever of these elements are applicable in your country, and what is in vogue, and what is practiced in your country and culture may not be the same in different countries and cultures of the world. And that is why when you move from your country and go to one other country, these various elements are what you will encounter as being very different to what you are experiencing or what you are practicing in your own country. So that's what makes countries and societies very different. So, for example, uh, in India, women in our society, apply the sindoor or the kumkum on their foreheads, not just on the foreheads, but also, have a mark over the vermilion partition, a vermilion mark over the parting of their hair, uh, because the parents have told them, or it is part of their cultural identity, and it is part of our culture. And if you believe in religion and cultural practice, you follow this, right? So when you go to Western societies, you will find meat that is served is beef, which is the meat of the cow or the buffalo. In Indian society, it's a taboo because we revere the cow as a very sacred animal and has a lot of religious significance. Drinking liquor in the US could be okay. It's okay in certain modern among modern people in India, but it is a punishable offense in Saudi Arabia and in many of the Arab states. So these things are very very important. So having an idea and understanding as to why such practices exist and why people follow something and do not follow something else, purely comes out of culture, and having that sort of knowledge and understanding and knowing how to deal is very very important. So that part is what we need to take care. So what are the different characteristics of culture? Yes, culture is learned, culture is unconscious, culture is shared, culture is integrated, culture is symbolic, culture is a way of life, culture is dynamic, culture is relative, and culture is universal. So, though we say culture is very unique to different geographies, societies, and culture, though we say it is unique, but there is nothing that stops people from one culture to learn, understand, adapt, and integrate, and use it relatively in different countries and cultures when they go into. So there is nothing that stops, and that is what we understand as cross-cultural awareness, cross-cultural adaptation, and cross-cultural sensitivity. So let's look at 10 important reasons as to why culture is very, very important, or culture studies and application of culture and cultural understanding is very important in business. Let's look at the 10 different elements, that makes every society and culture very different and very unique. So let's look at the first point, which is ancestry. Our cultures help us gain valuable information about our ancestry. Our cultural traditions are like pages in history. In a history book, should be read with with interest. Human beings do not live for eternity, but their cultures do. So cultures give a gateway to study about our ancestors. So the point in place is, if you want to understand why certain things do exist in society today, and why do we have certain beliefs, certain practices, certain norms, if you have to understand what is at present today and what is being practiced by people in a large society, then you must go back to history. So that's where we go back to ancestry, and then we find out our roots, then we find out what our forefathers did, and then that helps us to bridge and explain the context in today's understanding and practice. Secondly, self-realization is very important. So when we study about the roots of our cultures and follow them accordingly, we get to know about ourselves much better. We can better relate to our origin, our value, and ourselves a lot more. So it gives us a certain sense of pride, identity, and dignity when there is a lot of self realization. So only those individuals who do not have an understanding of their past, or who do not have a who do not refer to their history or do not refer to the roots, are the ones who are unable to understand many practices today. And that's why they don't give a lot of importance or heed to a lot of cultural elements that are existent. But those who are able to do that feel very proud about it, have a certain dignity about it, and they also are very happy transmitting it to their families and the youngsters and the other generation that follows up. Thirdly, evolutionary enlightenment. Knowing a culture in depth gives us a sneak peek into our own evolution. Our cultures have originated in ancient times when human beings started to live as a community. So, thus, studying about our culture and our civilization, our roots, our beliefs, our practices, and to get to know from where we started and to where we've come, that gives us a evolutionary enlightenment. So, that gives us a broad based understanding of our culture, our history, our tradition, and our roots as such. Fourthly, yes, moral values. Following a culture instills moral values in life because every culture considers certain values to be more important than anything else. So we give importance to certain values. Like for example, in our country, respect for elders is a very very a foremost value when it comes to Indian society. Or touching the feet of elders and taking their blessings is very much a cultural element, irrespective of the religion that we follow, but it still has a lot of cultural resemblance in those practices. So that's a moral value that we follow, and people in the West may not be very too keen on following something as such. So fifth is, yes, discipline. Cultural traditions helps us to keep us very disciplined, and every culture has formulated certain norms and traditions and practices which are laid down, and that is something that is rooted in a family, and that is what is explained by parents to their children, because it instills a certain degree of discipline. It instills a certain set of rules that youngsters need to follow. So that's precisely what we understand in our societies. Very very often we are criticized, our families or our societies and cultures, especially Indian society and cultures, very often criticized to be very orthodox, to be very conservative, to be very traditional minded, right now. But all that is necessary in our cultures is because it instills a certain amount of discipline among children. It lays down do's and don'ts that is very important for us. I mean, it's not a very open kind of a society, and you're devoid of any rules and then everybody does everything that they want. There are certain rules that we set down, which is very much a part of our culture, right? So culture plays this very important role of also disseminating knowledge, right? So, detailed study about every aspect of a culture can give us very profound knowledge, and cultures never demand blind followers. So, everything is well explained and accounted for in culture. For those of you who feel that you are unable to understand certain practices of today, why? When you ask these questions as to why do we need to do this, or why is there a practice like this, why do we not have to do certain things, or why do we have to do certain things on certain days? If you want to get detailed understanding of it, we need to go back to our roots and find out why such kind of practices were brought in, because at that point of time, there was not much of knowledge on education, and information technology and all of that had not grown to an extent, and people were still very illiterate, and they had to be guided, they had to be told right things in certain different ways, and that's how those practices did come about, right? They had to instill some fear, or the fear of God, or they had to bring in religion into it, and that's the only way that they could have these people follow it. And that's the same thing that has come into parlance today. So when we look today and then we are trying to find out, ask questions, and we are not able to find reasons, we need to go back and trace as to reasons why such kind of practices did exist and why it was propagated. Um, in those times or in those societies. So that will give us an explanation of why things are done, rather than maybe taking up to criticisms or trying to blame people to be very old fashioned and very orthodox in their mindsets and so on. Seventh aspect is, yes, compassion. Every culture teaches us to coexist with other cultures in the world, coexist with nature, coexist with uh, the surrounding. So it's very important. Culture teaches us to be very tolerant. Culture teaches us to be very compassionate. Culture teaches us to coexist. So this is what is different from very society, from society to society. Certain cultures are very, very aggressive. They do not care about anything, but yet on the other hand, you have cultures that are very compassionate, cultures that are very passionate about things around them, cultures that give a lot of importance to taking care of things in their surrounding. So that is an aspect that comes from culture. The eighth aspect, yes, it gives a lot of meaning to our own life. Culture teaches us the real meaning of life. Every phase of a life demands different actions, and our culture teaches us to do that. So it gives us a sense of what life is all about, what human life is all about, and why do we exist, and what is that we need to do, and what is our real purpose in life. All of that is something that we can understand. If we have a cultural understanding. The ninth aspect is it safeguards future generations. So cultural traditions and practices are not just practiced for today and forgotten, but it is transferred over to the next generation. So that's how parents teach these cultural practices and cultural beliefs and traditions to children, and when children grow up, they will further follow it and then practice it, and then they will further be able to pass that over to their future generations. It's very important that you keep your cultural um, you know practice is very intact, and then you pass it over to future generations, giving them a lot of meaning as to the reasons why it is done. So that's how culture stays permanent, and it gets transmitted to different generations over a period of time. Last of all, culture makes people responsible. So cultural traditions teach us to be very responsible human beings. A cultureless and a lawless human being is just equal to another animal. So we said one of the aspects that culture does is it ingrains a certain amount of discipline in all of us. Discipline to make us more self-disciplined, so that we have control over our own interactions and our own life, and also having to live in coexistence with others. So to also be a member of a large society and to belong to a particular culture, and not to something that endangers what everybody follows in society. So that aspect is what makes us very responsible, and that's the kind of behavior that every individual in every society and culture is expected to do. So these are the 10 reasons why getting to study culture is very important, and from the international context, very important to understand these things. So when we are looking at various cultural elements in different societies and cultures, so going a little more deeper and trying to understand why and what of it will make our cultural awareness and understanding and study a lot more enriched. So, what are the three layers of culture? Now, this is something that you will be able to experience when you meet people of different countries and cultures. So, when you see people in different societies, you will find out that there are three aspects to culture. There are three layers. So, one set of layer is called the surface layer. Another set of layer is the hidden layer, and the last set is called the invisible layer. So, three layers that we have. So let's look at what it means. So the outer layer is what you will be able to foremost see in when you interact with people of different cultures. So what comes to what meets the eye? It could be the behavior of people, it could be the clothing, it could be the language, it could be the type of lifestyle they live, it could be the houses that they live in, a certain amount of family orientation that they have, food habits. Everything that's visible to you when you see somebody from outside for the first time. So that's the aspect of a visible culture. Now, hidden culture refers to the norms and values which a community holds. So, what is considered right and wrong, or what is good and bad? Now, this is something that is there within every individual. So these are learned aspects of a culture, learned aspects of a culture that's there ingrained within you. Like, for example, a norm or a value or a belief is something that's within you and which is not visible to outsiders, but it definitely comes out, in terms of our interactions, or when we make opinions, or when we pass judgments, or it comes out in terms of our attitudes, and then finally in terms of behavior. So invisible culture, that's the third layer, the innermost layer, refers to the deepest level of implicit culture. So understanding the core of the cultural onion is the key to successfully working with other cultures. The core consists of basic assumptions that we have, or basic rules that we have. So something that's where deep down that's ingrained. Like, for example, when we say, influenced by the Indian tradition or the Indian ethos. Now that is something that's very invisible. So something that's there within us, and then and it comes out very often into the conscious aspect, and then it becomes visible to people when we make decisions as such. So that could be a very invisible aspect of a culture. Like, for example, world over, Indians are seen to be very compassionate and very peace loving people. Now that is not something that's a surface trait, or it's not a hidden trait, but it is something that is our invisible trait, right? So this whole showing this face of compassion, or being very peace loving in our behavior, being very tolerant in dealing with people and countries and cultures and issues, is something that is there, which is part of our Indian tradition. So that aspect is what we could say is an example of an invisible culture. Right, so now we're coming to this interesting part uh, called the culture shock. So what happens when expatriates are asked to move to a foreign country and take up an international assignment? So when somebody moves from their country, in which they're very familiar with their society and culture, and they've been a part of it, and they've been living there and practicing it over many years, now this individual is given an expatriate assignment and is asked to go and do a certain job in a subsidiary. So he or she travels to a foreign country, and then when he or she goes to that particular country and lands in that particular country, and the first step that you take in that country, and you see the people, you see the surrounding, and you start interacting with people, and then you slowly start, mingling and mixing with them, that is when you will be able to experience something called the culture shock. Now culture shock is not something that you will experience on the first day that you land in a foreign country, or the first interaction that you have with foreigners. Culture shock is something that happens slightly a little later, maybe after about 2 weeks of stay, or almost about 1 month of stay, is when you will begin to experience this particular aspect, a psychological feeling called the culture shock. Now culture shock is a term that is used to describe the anxiety and the feelings of surprise, disorientation, confusion, a whole lot of mixed feeling that could go on in your mind when people have to operate with an entirely different culture, or a cultural or a social environment in a foreign country. So it grows out of the difficulties in assimilating to the new culture, causing difficulties in knowing what is appropriate and what is not. So this is where, when you move from your country and culture and you go to another country and culture where the practices are extremely dissimilar, there's no sort of similarity between the country that you belonged to, and the culture that you practiced here, and the culture that is practiced in a foreign country. So you find that you're going to a place where everything is exactly opposite, and you're not able to make sense. You're not able to find meaning as to where and why and how people do and why they behave in a certain way, and there's no explanation that's given to any of these things. So that's when you get a little disoriented, you get a little upset, and that's the experience that you have, which we call as culture shock. So this is a very interesting slide that talks about the process of how you will experience. So we've given an example here. So you leave your home country because you've got a foreign assignment. Your company has asked you to go and work in a subsidiary in a foreign country, and you're going to go and relocate yourself to a foreign country, take up that assignment, and you're going to be working there. So you're leaving home, and you let's say the assignment is in Australia, so you go to Australia, and after those 2 or 3 weeks, right? Initially, what is happening is a lot of excitement. So you we call this feeling as a feeling of a tourist. So when you're a tourist, when you go to a foreign country, in this case, when you go to Australia, you're going to be very enamored, you're going to be very surprised, you're going to be very astonished at what you see in Australia. So when you go from India, you will say, wow, what a beautiful country Australia is, how beautiful people are, how fair people are, how well mannered they are, how helpful they are, and how well the facilities are. So you could go on appreciating it in the initial stage, because that's what a tourist will often do. He is always looking at things from a very brighter side, and is always very appreciative of everything that he or she sees in that particular country. But after about 2 or 3 weeks, when you um, encounter the same set of elements, so that's when you will feel a little disoriented or feel a little uh, unhappy about it, because things are not the same. Because from a comfort zone in which you were experienced in your culture, when you get into that particular country, now everything is so very new, everything is so very different, you've got to learn everything from scratch, is what makes you experience that feeling of culture shock. So what can happen there is people, expatriates who experience culture shock, experience this very unhappy sort of a feeling, and they get very upset, disoriented. So that's a point when an expatriate can decide that he or she is feeling very homesick and cannot cope, and then quit, and then get back to the home country. So that's what we call as an expatriate failure, right? But if an expatriate is made aware of all of these things in the beginning, and if he has been, given enough of culture awareness, and a lot of cross-cultural training has been given, and all of this was included in the the pre-departure training element, and if the Mendel Hall Dunbar Odawa model was very properly applied to this particular context, so that is when an expatriate who experiences culture shock, with all of that effort that we've put in our cross-cultural training, and uh, and uh, and the application will help the expatriate to overcome. So that's where he's going to pull up. Once he feels that experiences culture shock, and he feels that he really wants to quit, but with the amount of training that we've given, he should be, or he will be able to cope up. And then that's when he pulls himself up, and then he goes into this phase called adjustment. So initially he overcomes that really dis experience or displeasure, and then pulls up, and then continues completing his assignment. And then and over a period of time, what happens is the individual becomes so very used to that particular country and culture, then he slowly starts losing touch with his own home country's culture, and then he becomes very much a part of the culture in Australia, and then becomes a part of that particular society, and everything becomes quite normal, so he gets into that comfortable zone. And then the same thing can happen. So once he's there in the foreign country, and then he's very happy with his assignment, completes the assignment, and when he has to come back to his home country, so he's gotten used to the foreign country and culture, he's become very comfortable with what he's experienced in Australia. Now when he or she's got to come back to the home country, that is when they experience something in reverse called the reverse culture shock. So when you have lived in Australia for about 5 to 8 years, so you become very much a part of the Australian culture and society. And when you have to come back to India, and so when you come to India, you will experience something very similar, a similar sort of a culture shock, which we call as the reverse culture shock. So there again in India, you've got to again a lot of help and support needs to be given to help this person to get adjusted to the new to his own country and culture back again. And then it'll take a little bit of time. That's the readjustment phase. And once that is done, after a few months, or after close to a year, he or she will definitely be able to get adjusted and get back to the normal life that he or she was leading before he or she took up the expatriate assignment. So this is that very interesting aspect which talks about culture shock. So what are the signs that you will have to look out in expatriates if they are experiencing culture shock? There's going to be very high degree of irritability, fluctuating appetite. They're going to be very moody, disrupted sleep, homesickness, avoiding locals, reading all the time, trying to keep off from social interactions, always trying to be very aloof, confused, very negative about everything, unhappy. depressed, physical illness, boredom, low energy, right? So all of these are signs that can explain that the expatriate is going through uh, culture shock, and that's where uh, the managers, both in the home country as well as the host country where he or she's taking up the assignment, that entire team has to swing into action to make sure how they can help the expatriate to overcome all of these negative signs of culture, negative signs of culture shock, and then be able to help that individual to cope up and get adjusted. So that is where we come into this aspect of cross cultural training. So what do you do? What do you do? So this is a very important aspect of training. Cross cultural training is when expatriates are going to move to a foreign country, to a different society and culture, and they're going to go and stay there and work, right? So that's where they need to be trained, and that's when they need to be made aware of what they can experience in that particular country and enable them with enough of cross cultural knowledge and skills that will help them to cope up and overcome that phase of culture shock. So cross-cultural training can be broadly divided into two types. The first part will talk about the general awareness, which covers about handling foreign clients, increasing the awareness about foreign employees of the same company, facilitating negotiations. So what are the set of things that he or she needs to do uh, in his or her job, or in interactions with the employees of that particular country and culture, is that first level of training. The second level of training specifically talks about the country and the culture, the society and the culture. So this is very useful, especially when you go out of your company. So knowing the language, knowing religion, knowing how to uh, interact with members of the opposite sex or the same sex, family orientations, public behavior, behavior in public transportation when you take. So traditions, values, norms, behavior, discipline, road traffic behavior, all of that is what is the second aspect that's very important. So the cross-cultural training looks into that aspect very more specifically. So cross-cultural competence is what we are trying to enable in expatriates, so that the expatriate will get trained and imbibe those adequate skills that will make the expatriate very competent enough to handle any sort of a culture shock situation that he or she is going to experience. So cross-cultural competence refers to the knowledge, skill, and the effect of motivation that enables individuals to adapt very effectively in cross-cultural environments. So cross-culture competency is defined as an individual's capability that contributes to intercultural effectiveness regardless of the particular intersection of cultures. So the extent to which, or the degree to which, an employee is able to face it, overcome it, manage it, and then also successfully deal with that issue and problem is purely attributed to cross-cultural competency. And if that needs to be enabled, then cross-cultural training needs to be very very effective. And premature pre-departure training in which the CCT is done needs to take care of those aspects very specifically. Right. So how do we develop the development of a cross-cultural competency model? So we talk about this particular model specifically. This is very similar to the Mendel Hall Dunbar and Odavo model, which talks about these elements of how to introduce and enable an expatriate so that he or she becomes very competent. So making awareness, creating awareness about a particular culture, and testing the knowledge, and then finding out all those differences that a particular individual has when it comes to his mindset or attitude towards those cultural elements. All of that needs to be handled very effectively and evaluated to enable. So enough knowledge and skill is imparted to the expatriate so that the expatriate becomes culturally competent and is able to face any sort of issue or a difficulty when he or she witnesses issues or faces discomfortable uncomfortable situations or situations of discomfort in the foreign country. So, what are the cross cultural methods that we use very much? So, these are some of the methods that we use, different techniques of training or methods of training. We use the didactic model, then we use the experiential model, which uh, gives the expatriate a very hands on kind of understanding about culture. And there are also preliminary visits that we also include, where The expatriate sometimes gets an exposure to go to that particular country even before he or she takes up a full-time assignment. So those experiences and understanding how these experiences are are understood by the expatriate, and then giving enough explanations as to why and how things are different in different countries goes in lot of extent. Third is, yes, there is a method called attribution. So you attribute it to internally or externally, and then giving that knowledge of explanation as to why things are like this, or why do people do it in this way, or why do they behave in this way. So that's an important aspect. That's part of the methodology. Language for sure, ensuring that the expatriate is adequately imparted and trained with survival level of knowledge and also working level knowledge of the local language of that particular country, if English is not the language that is widely spoken. So that will help the individual to interact in the neighborhood and get things done on his own. And then there is cultural awareness, and yes, there are interactions and there are cognitive behavioral modifications, and then lastly there is also sequential training that we do. Very importantly, cognitive behavioral modification is very important because we have stereotypes. Every individual coming from a certain culture, we have stereotypes, and we also have prejudices about people of a different country and culture. And we um, will have this tendency to look down upon people, their language, their food, their practices, the way they live, the way they behave, and the attitudes that they possess. So that negative aspect of ours, or that prejudice and stereotype, could lead us to behave in a certain way that may not be acceptable by people in those cultures and societies. So that's where we need to be sensitized about those areas of where prejudices and stereotypes are there, and that's where the cognitive modification aspect will enable us to change our attitude and our mindset and be able to deal with people a lot more effectively, and in a lot more in a manner that is very assimilating, a manner that is very friendly and acceptable to people of that particular culture. So these are a set of training tools or methods that can be very um, you know very effectively used when we are developing that cross-cultural training module, and then use that very effectively to deal when we are imparting this sort of training. So, what is the framework that helps us to deal with cross-cultural aspects? Yes, world over we have this very prominent template that we use called the Hofstede's cross-cultural model. So this enables us to look at different cultures and relatively use six different frameworks that Hofstede has identified, with which we will be able to understand how societies and cultures and what makes them similar and what makes them different. So Geert Hofstede is a culture expert, and his studies are used widely on the basis of which this model is developed. His studies primarily talks about the interactions between national cultures and organization cultures, demonstrated that there are national regional cultural groupings that affect the behavior of societies and organizations, and that is very persistent over time. So what Hofstede generally goes on to explain is the way your society is the way your organization is going to be. So your national culture is going to have a influence over your organization culture. So unless and until we understand what's the difference in terms of the national culture in those countries, and how it is influencing the lifestyle of people or the mindsets of people and the way people behave in a particular culture, we will never be able to know why and how things are very different in that particular country. So what are the dimensions that he talks about? Yes, these are the six dimensions that Hofstede talks about first index called the uh, power distance. So we could be going to different societies where our societies could be high on power distance or low on power distance. When a society is very high on power distance, this is where people in positions of authority or people in power are respected, and there's a lot of distance, and we maintain that hierarchy, or we maintain that spatial difference between people and power, compared to those societies where power distance is very low. So in those countries where power distance is very low, uh, authority and power is not considered very important, and uh, people in power and authority will very freely mix with everybody. There's not much of distance that you maintain, all of that can be is very much lowered. Secondly, we could be societies and cultures could be promoting individualism. They could be giving a lot of importance to the I culture rather than a collective culture of doing everything in a group or doing everything in a consensus or promoting what is called as a we culture. Thirdly, we could have societies that are male dominated societies and female dominated societies, or societies that give a lot of importance to equality between men and women. Fourth is, yes, we could have cultures that avoid uncertainty, and we could have cultures that embrace uncertainty. So, cultures that avoid uncertainty are the ones that are very much very traditional and yeah, and do things that are very routine, and they do not innovate or very slow to adapt and adopt new things. But cultures that embrace uncertainty are the ones that are always looking out for new things. They get very bored and tired doing the same thing again and again. They want to break that routine, break that pattern, and want to do something. So these are cultures of cultures of people who are very adventurous, very high on risk taking, very highly innovative in nature. They're not worried about and bothered about the consequences as long as they're able to get the thrill of doing something new. Fifth, we have pragmatic cultures and normative cultures. Pragmatic cultures are cultures where people are very, very practical and look at things very immediately in terms of logic and have an explanation that's very well satisfied rather than normative cultures. Normative cultures are generally very rooted in the past and don't seek a lot of explanations. It's something that was followed earlier, so we're going to do it. So they're going to stick to it without asking or without questioning some of these norms and practices. Lastly, we're going to look at indulgent and restrained cultures. Indulgent cultures are those cultures where people are really very spendthrifts or people who indulge in a lot of pleasures in life and do not restrict their behaviors, are very, very indulgent. They're very open. They live for today. They're very happy about what they do. So there's not much of restrictions that they impose upon themselves. Whereas in restrained behaviors, yes, there is a lot of thought about tomorrow, saving for tomorrow, worried about tomorrow, and ensuring that what we do today will have consequences for tomorrow. So we're very more controlled, very more restrained, very more um, cautious in our behavior. So those kind of cultures are called the restraint cultures. So what Hofstede does with these dimensions and what it helps is these are six different dimensions that can help us to understand how is our culture in our society, and then how is it in the culture that we in the country and the culture that we are going to. So that explains to us whether we are going to a culture and society that is very similar, or going to a culture and society that is very different to each other as such. So that is what will explain, and this gives us a lot more awareness and understanding on what's the right type of behavior that we need to exhibit. So this gives us a set of national culture clusters. So these are regional clusters around the world. We have the culture clusters. The Anglo clusters are wherever a group of countries which were colonized by the British, and so the British influence is what makes them very Anglo-based culture. So very, very English, influence, or very they have an influence of the Great Britain over the life and the lifestyle. Then we have Arab cultures, which are mostly the Arab countries that you see, who are largely Islamic in nature, and all the practices are derived from the Shariat and the religious laws that they follow. Then we have the Far Eastern countries, which are slightly away. We have Germanic cultures. We have Latin American cultures that are in South America, and you have Latin European, which has a lot of these cultures which have an influence to uh, influenced by the Hispanic groups. We have Near Eastern, we have Nordic, and there are many other countries that are very independent, because these are comprised of people who come from different countries who really do not have cultural identity of their own, but something that's very, very neutral, or something that has a mix of all the kind of culture. So these are regional clusters. Now, this is very important because countries could come from. We're dealing with countries in a particular regional cluster. More or less, it's the same that will be. applicable. So there's not much of difference that we need to do when we are dealing with countries within a given region or within a given cluster as such. So a few terms that we need to be aware of. Yes, cultural sensitivity is very important. So the term that we often keep using, in reference to international expatriation or in terms of cross culture, is to be very sensitive, to be aware, and also know what is, what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong in different cultures before we take that step or we start behaving or judging people, of a different culture. So cultural awareness is knowing that there are multiple different cultures based on religion, ethnicity, nationality, and other factors that have different attitudes and outlooks. So having this understanding that countries and cultures are different, and obviously, yes, because of that difference, there will be a lot of differences in terms of the cultural elements. So what is applicable and followed in our country and culture may not be followed and practiced in other cultures. So secondly, cultural sensitivity involves accepting those differences without insisting your own culture is better or that everyone should do it your way. So that is where the cultural sensitivity comes in, not just being aware, but also trying to ensure that you do not impose your attitudes, you do not impose your culture, or you do not claim that your culture is very superior to, compared to the culture of another country, and trying to enforce and want everybody to follow, or looking down upon people and practices of a different culture. So that's where that sensitive aspect is going to come out in terms of our behavior. And cultural sensitivity skills are sometimes called cultural competency, or the ability to work alongside people of different cultural attitudes and behaviors, and to do that very effectively. So that's where you need to be cross culturally trained, and you have to be made cross culturally competent, so that you are sensitive enough to the people of different countries and cultures, and then thereby be able to assimilate yourself and be able to work along with them, and then be able to be very successful in your dealings and interactions with people of a different culture. So cross-cultural sensitivity is the knowledge, awareness, and acceptance of other cultures. On the individual level, it allows travelers and workers to successfully navigate uh, in different cultures that they are interacting with, whereas it is considered one of the primary factors that drive organizations or make organizations very successful, or to operate in foreign countries and cultures. So these are the areas, as I spoke about, culturally sensitive areas are religion, ethnicity, national origin, gender, age, education, socio-economic status of people, sexual orientation, mental challenges, physical challenges. So all of these are elements. So these are things that we need to be very sensitive, because this is very different from country to country and culture to culture, and having an idea and understanding about all of this definitely makes us more competent. So what's a cultural paradox? So generally, along with cultural sensitivity, there's something called cultural paradox. A culture paradox is a seemingly absurd or a contradictory statement or proposition about culture and its elements, which, when investigated, may prove to be unfounded. So it's very similar to a prejudice or a stereotype that you always possess, that you always think that people of this country and culture are like this. So, but when you go there, when you experience and interact with people, then you realize that your notions of the prejudice and the stereotype were absolutely wrong or were wrongly confounded. So when perception meets reality, you realize the reality is very different to your perception. So that's a cultural paradox. That's when you realize the absurdity of what you were thinking and the reality that you were able to experience. So some of the other thing, some of the examples could be long-term versus short-term orientation. That you thought people of a particular country are very short-term oriented, but you might end up knowing that there are people who think and are very more futuristic in their ways of behavior and understanding. So every culture has opposing values when it comes to religion, when it comes to food habits, when it comes to practices, when it comes to norms and values. So all of that, what's okay with you in your country may not be okay with others in another country. And so that's what gives rise to paradoxes, and be able to navigate very comfortably by having an understanding and being very sensitive helps us to overcome these paradoxes and makes us very successful to operate in these cultures with people in the long run. So these are examples of cultural paradoxes. Um, in Africa, when you are presenting your business card, you got to always do it using your right hand. And Asia offers the card with both hands, so we use both our hands and then we bow down in a certain way and we give it. It's the same way in China, Japan, South Korea, and India. Australia and New Zealand do not give a lot of importance to cards. They could just give it, in their left hand, or they could just leave it on the table and ask you to pick it up. So it could be of that sort. In Europe, power breakfasts are very important in countries like France, Switzerland, and England, because most meetings happens with the power breakfast, and so that's when these delegates or business officials come, and they have this culture of eating and mixing around and talking, and that's how a lot of business happens or interactions happens as well. In the Middle East and Gulf countries, presenting a card with the right hand is very respectful. In Canada and USA, it is acceptable to make a cold call. You can make a cold call without taking a prior appointment. So it's okay in those countries because people are fine with it in that particular culture. um, when you are dealing with people in Africa, be prepared when you go for a business meeting or when you go to meet people in there, individually, or when you go to meet them in a gathering or in a social gathering. Be prepared to see a lot of people. Or if somebody says they're coming visiting you, they could come with a big entourage of their own. So they're always very happy and very jovial, and people will love to be seen in large groups and mix around, generally in large groups. So that's what we need to keep in mind. In Asia, decide before you hand when you interacting with people of different cultures or business or delegations, do a very thorough uh, check of it, do a little homework of it. So go a little prepared is what that emphasizes on. In Australia and New Zealand, you've got to speak to the point, be very specific, you've got to be very punctual. In Europe, class conscious is very important, so you've got to maintain decorum, etiquette, dressing behavior, blue suits, right? So uh, clothing has to be very formal, and they're very and you wear blue suits. These are called business suits. And then you have to be well mannered, and there has to be you know you have to be good natured, and there are no excuses for bad manners or things that can slip out. So you've got to be very conscious. You've got to be knowing all of this before you deal with people of that particular culture. So in the Middle East and Gulf countries, you maintain royalty, which means you've got to high power distance has to be maintained when people in power and authority, and they prefer detailed discussions, and they prefer the local language. You've got to speak in Arabic or in English and not in any other language. Most of the times they do their business in Arabic, except for those few who had interactions with certain foreign companies or MNCs. In Canada and USA, a meeting has to begin on time and it has to end on time. When it is scheduled, it has to go on. There is very small talk that is allowed in between meetings. So you've got to stick to the agenda, stick to the point, stick to the business, negotiate, and get finished or done as quickly as possible. So in Africa, in rural areas, avoid strong eye contact because they think it's very offensive. In Asia, avoid eye contact and touching the body. Having hugging people is not allowed in Asian countries. So you maintain a little bit of distance. In Australia and New Zealand, uh, it's not a good sign that if you have red eyes and you meet people there. Europeans hate shaking legs with dirty shoes, or somebody who's very shabbily dressed, or shaking legs, crossing legs, and sitting before elders or people who are in power and authority is a definite no-no in countries, in many of our Asian countries. And shaking the leg and youngsters shaking their legs when elders are sitting is a definite no-no. And you cannot sit when people older are standing, or when older people are standing, you cannot sit equally along with them. So that's a definite no-no. And Middle East and Gulf countries, you do not walk in front of an Arab who's praying, or you do not disturb them when they are praying, and you don't walk on their prayer mat. It's disrespectful. And you don't hurry at the dinner or the lunch party, and you do not eat, and they eat separately. Men and women eat separately, so you don't mix along with them when you eat or when you interact. There's a lot of difference that they maintain between men and women. So masculinity and femininity concept operates over there, so you've got to be very clear. So just like the way you mix with men or women in your country and culture may not be the same way that you would have to do there, and so that's a point that you've got to keep in mind. And Canada and USA standing too close to, you know, to a North American may be considered, or considered to be an invasion of personal space. So it's always very important. There's something called a spatial proximity. So you need to know what's your formal space and what's your informal space. So formal space is where you need to maintain some distance between the individuals. So you can't get too close and upfront when you talk to them, because uh, in certain cultures, people may feel it very uncomfortable, and it's definitely not appropriate when you do not know the person very well. So in Africa, a light, warm handshake is acceptable form of greeting when you meet anyone. And in Asia, especially in Japan, you got to bow down. Shaking hands is acceptable. A hug may not be acceptable in many Asian countries, or a hug may not be acceptable between people of two sexes, men and women, or shaking hands with a woman is still not okay with many cultures in Asian countries. So that's where you do the namaste. So in Australia and New Zealand, during parties, host will introduce to the other guests. Do not expect gifts from foreigners who are doing business with them. So gifting is also a different in different cultures. In some countries and cultures, you always have to meet people with a gift, or you go with a box of sweets. But in certain countries and cultures, when you do business, that sort of a practice is not there. So that's considered to be bribing, or it may not be accepted as appropriate. So Europe, you shake hands with a firm grip, so that shows people that you're very confident, and you're very, um, and you're very positive, and you show confidence, and there is nothing that you're holding back, or there's nothing very, um, dubious, or nothing very hidden that you have in your mind. So that's what you're trying to express. And the Middle East and Gulf countries, gifts should be presented publicly to the group after a deal is closed. In addition to the handshake, they may touch other arms and shoulders, or embrace when they are too close, when the members are too close and they know each other very well, and they want to express that joy and happiness. They could give a gentle hug. So in Canada and USA, handshake and full hand grip is quite acceptable. So these are very common cultural practices. That's very important when we have to know these nuances. So finally, we've come to the end of this topic. So we spoke about the importance of culture in international business. So if international businesses internationally have to really succeed, then culture is the core. And then especially for international HRM, for the team that's going to handle expatriates and have candidates go to different countries of the world and take up international assignments, and be able to successfully complete their assignments, and then be able to overcome all those difficulties like culture shock and all of that. It all boils down to this aspect of cross cultural training, enabling that the right candidates are picked up, and these candidates are well trained, and then enough of support is given to them, so that they become culturally competent. So when they go to different countries and cultures of the world, they will be able to be very sensitive. They will keep aside their biases and prejudices and stereotypes, and be able to look at people and culture in a very open manner, and then be able to accept and appreciate people and cultures and practices in those foreign countries, and then be able to become a part of them in course of time. So that will enable expatriates to be very successful, make them very competent, and have them do their jobs well and execute a business strategy and the purpose for which they've gone internationally. So thank you.